When we think of science, we usually think of the classroom, of periodic tables and laws, theories and postulates. The classroom lays our foundation in science, but in reality, science exists within the real world. Science is constantly growing, changing, and evolving to fit our conception of the world. In response to this, a genre of writing arose, popular science writing, which takes the real-life events of research and discovery and delivers them in a package for mass consumption. These books respond to a need to understand modern science as it pertains to our lives. However, in one very massive way, these books are failing readers in their craft. We're going to be pulling from 3 books today. This list is meant to be representative, not exhaustive. We will be discussing Paul Offit's Vaccinated, One Man's Quest to Defeat the World's Deadliest Diseases, Richard Preston's The Hot Zone, the terrifying true story of the origins of the Ebola virus, and David Quammen's Spillover, Animal Infections and the Next Human Pandemic. These books are biomedical in nature, which I have chosen intentionally as a biomedical researcher. These books have a lot in common. Preston and Quammen are journalists by trade, and Offit follows many of the traditions of journalistic writing. While these techniques have their places in news and media, I am concerned with their place in science. Journalism has a very specific focus on events and outcomes, which has its role. But does it have a role in science? I would argue against its pervasive use in science writing. Let's consider Offit's book more closely. In this novel, he presents the story of Maurice Hillman, a vaccine researcher and the creator of over 40 vaccines, including the MMR vaccine, hepatitis A and B, meningitis, and pneumonia. Alongside Hillman's story, Offit also presents many of the other key players in vaccine history. However, in using this journalistic style, we lose much of the fraught stress of vaccine development. It seems that Hillman magically knows what to do and how to prevent problems researchers weren't aware would be problems. When we consider science as an outcome, we lose the process that generated that outcome. And at the core of every scientific practice is the scientific method. If we lose that, we lose the magnitude of science, which is incredibly harmful. Offit, Preston, and Quammen all consider topics that are incredibly important to human health. Vaccination prevented 21 million hospitalizations and 732,000 child deaths from 1994 to 2013. Ebola ravages the African continent, and the viral agent that causes the disease is unlike any others we have observed. The interaction between humans and the natural world are constantly changing as we expand into wild territory, and that comes with consequences. We are currently in a pandemic that likely came from animals. These authors are spot on in their material and have clear respect for it, but that is not enough. Approaching these books from a literary lens, they leave much to be desired in their novels. As we consider the structure of these books, we find story, but not narrative. We know that story is X happened, then Y, then Z. Conversely, narrative is X happened, which caused Y, which eventually led to Z. This distinction is important because it implies that the events impact each other. Further, stories rely on the order of events, while a narrative can change those shapes to create a specific impact and increase the strength of the thesis of a work. These books are a series of events, usually put in temporal order. They have a story, but no narrative. Offit deeply struggles with transition, which would have profoundly benefited from consideration of narrative structure. Consider the content of Chapter 5, Coughs, Colds, Cancers, and Chickens. A neat alliteration features a section that begins with Hillman, our main character, jumps to Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin, and ends with a discussion on chicken eggs and their use in vaccine development. There are no transitions between these topics. Things simply happen in Offutt's novel without clear cause or effect. Often, these events seem to be discrete from each other. Without a sense of narrative, Offutt muddles his thesis and the power of including the information he presents. Quammen gives up on coherent narrative altogether and just writes a series of discrete novellas and binds them into one book. This is concerning, namely because humans are natural storytellers. We like stories, and it's how we make patterns within personal and world history. These authors, by neglecting narrative, are neglecting their readers. Consider Preston's work and the use of dramatic storytelling. He receives a lot of criticism for it, including from Quammen, but succeeds in integrating groups that may have been otherwise disjointed. Now, I'm not calling for a specific narrative in science writing such as the hero's journey, but we must consider how the events impacted each other, how they changed the outcome of an event. Outcomes do not exist in a vacuum. Despite Preston's strengthened narrative, all three writers fall victim to lackluster characterization, and this connects back to the narrative strength of these books. Characters exist with their names and little else. In Quammen's first section, we meet 19 named characters in 49 pages, yet know very little about them. We have very little need to connect to or empathize with any of the characters named in this chapter. All three authors fall into the trap of describing a person for a paragraph and leaving readers to float. But one paragraph doesn't capture people. And people do science. The way those people work and think is incredibly important. We don't fully understand the intensity at which Maurice Hillman, the main character of Offutt's novel, does his research until 10 chapters into the book about this man's research. Events aren't enough. Names aren't enough. We need narratives, and we need people. Fundamentally speaking, these challenges are questions of craft. These authors are skilled in their research and understand what information to include, but when we look at the words on the page, we see a need for interdisciplinary work. They've so inundated us with the who, what, and where of these stories that they've neglected how their words shape this story. Let's consider a completely different style of writing, also written by a journalist, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. Just like the science writers, Capote presents a true story, the story of a horrific murder in Kansas. But he does so completely differently than Offutt, Quammen, or Preston do. He presents the information as a narrative. He uses time as a tool and shifts perspective between characters. We meet characters, care for them, worry for them. Capote begins with telling the reader the murder will happen, but by the time the story comes to the murder, the reader is still shocked and hurt for the family. At the core of this is simply intentional writing. Capote crafts his story using the tools of creative writing. When he wrote In Cold Blood, creative nonfiction was unheard of. He put the genre on the map. Looking to outside genres gives writers the tools to redefine the impact of their writing. Creative nonfiction took the tools of fiction to create the same emotional impact but presented real events. Capote has a difficult conversation with how communities are impacted by crime, particularly senseless crime. Consider how Offutt's thesis on the forgotten history of vaccines would change if we cared for Maurice Hillman and his work. How might we respond to COVID-19 if Quammen were able to bring zoonotic diseases into our consciousness? Would our feelings toward the challenges of Africa change if Preston were able to make us worry about the implications of Ebola? Scientists care about their work. No one does the sheer quantity of required work if they don't care. And yet, when we write about science, the readers are not given a reason to care. There is no implication that this writing impacts their lives. The goal of creative writing is not to flex our traumas or to show off the worlds we can create in our minds. We write because we want to bring something from our lives into others' lives. Writing is storytelling. We tell stories to connect, full stop. If we are not writing about science with those same goals, we are failing as writers. If we want to bring science into the lives of those outside of science, and we very desperately need to, we need to look at the work done in literature. We know what tools are available and how they work. Science writing can no longer be a series of events on a page if we want people to care. Writing about science from a journalistic lens is fine, but if we're going to see radical change, we need to bring in creative writing and a literary process. Our words must be intentional, impactful, and elegant. There is no reason for this writing to be lackluster. There is nothing wrong done with the work done by Offutt, Quammen, or Preston, but it could be so much stronger. It could be so much more. We could care for Maurice Hillman the same way Offutt clearly cares for his mentor, but we don't. We could see the dangers of zoonotic diseases and work towards preventing devastation, but we don't. We could understand the dangers associated with the viruses in Preston's book, but we don't. Fundamentally, it comes down to their writing. Presenting a series of events isn't enough. Writers have a responsibility to make their writing live within people. The only way we can do that is through the mastery of craft. This demands interdisciplinary work between literature and science, and I believe there is great success held in that world. To understand how this world works requires work and cooperation. We are not failing, but we can improve, and absolutely deserve to grow as writers, as scientists, and as people. Thank you so much for listening. Please direct any questions to the email above, and we'll see you in the next video.